There are 5 players on the Buffalo Bills that deserve more love. I'm going to tell you who the most underappreciated players on the team are today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of the Herd Mentality Substack, co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, co-host of the NFL First Read Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, folks, welcome in. I want to discuss with you 5 different players on this Buffalo Bills roster that I think are underappreciated, players that deserve more love. And one of my favorite things about doing this podcast is the community that's been built around it. I have the opportunity to interact with and engage with fans from across the globe. And whether it's through our Discord community or the subtext, I like to interact. And in doing so, I fulfill the joy and fun that comes with interacting with other Bills fans, but I also gain a lot of perspective on the fan base and, you know, what certain thoughts are out there. And I think it creates for a fun dynamic between developing my own opinions and breaking them down for you here on the podcast and foiling that against, you know, what I perceive to be the collective opinions of the fan base. And so I have 5 players today that I just think deserve more love. They're underappreciated players on this team. And I have a sleeper that I'll get to, a deep sleeper. We'll talk about that player later. There's a rising star that I think deserves some more love. There's a very important role player, another defensive starter, but I want to start with really my motivation for this entire episode, and it is highlighting tight end Dawson Knox as a player that I think has become underappreciated. And I think there's some layers to it and reasons why maybe there's not as much love as there should be for Dawson Knox, but let's have the conversation. We'll work all the way through it. Let's start first by acknowledging Dawson Knox's status among the history of Buffalo Bills tight ends. And obviously the Bills do not have a storied history of amazing tight ends, right? Pete Metzelaars is the guy. And then who is it after that? Well, Dawson Knox is knocking on the door. He's 3rd all time for Buffalo Bills tight ends for receiving yards. He's 2nd all time among Buffalo Bills tight ends for receiving touchdowns. In fact, he's only 2 behind Pete Metzelaars for the most. There's a good chance when it's all said and done that Dawson Knox is the most prolific tight end the Bills have ever had. Now, we certainly hope that Dalton Kincaid changes all of that, but Knox is the guy right now that is knocking on the door. How about this? Dawson Knox is number 2 all time for the Buffalo Bills for playoff receiving touchdowns. Andre Reed has the most with 9. Dawson Knox, number 2 with 6. So he's certainly done a lot during his time with the Bills to cement himself as one of the better tight ends the team has ever had. But when you look at what he offers this team right now, I think that's really where I think the underappreciation comes from. He's a very effective player for the Bills, especially for the role that he plays in line for the rushing offense. The Bills' rushing offense is really good. We've talked about that a lot on this podcast, and not only is it really good, they also run the ball a lot. Top 5 in percentage of plays that are runs last year, and top 5 in pretty much any imaginable way that you want to measure how good a rushing offense is. Well, Dawson Knox gets some credit for that because of how he functions as an inline blocking tight end. Not that he's the best inline blocking tight end in the NFL, but he's certainly above average, and his presence allows the Bills to run the ball like they want to. And he plays a lot of snaps. I know nobody's going to look at the receiving production and be overly enamored with it, but last year in 2024, Dawson Knox played the second most snaps among offensive skill players. Dawson Knox. So you had your 5 offensive linemen, you had Josh Allen, then you had Mac Hollins, and the second most amount of snaps by an offensive skill player, Dawson Knox. He plays a lot of snaps for the offense that I have said repeatedly has a heck of an argument to be the best the Bills have ever put on the field. I think there are 2 things that take away from Dawson Knox's perceived value that leads to us having this discussion right now. I think number 1, it is the receiving production of late. Each of the last 2 seasons, Dawson Knox finished with exactly 22 catches, right? That's barely over 1 catch per game on average. And in a world where fantasy football and prop bets drive so much opinion, I think you can lose track of skill players that aren't necessarily super productive catching or running, but they do fill a valuable role for a football team. And I think Dawson Knox is a perfect example of that. So no, you're not going to look at 22 catches last year or 22 catches in 2023 and feel like he's delivering a lot of receiving production, because he's not. But that doesn't mean he's not an important player that fills an important role that deserves more love. The other thing that I think takes away from the appreciation for Dawson Knox is his contract, which initially was $14 million a season, where he was coming off of a year where he had almost 600 yards receiving, 587 receiving yards, and 9 touchdowns when, he wasn't the number 2 option on the team or anything like that. He was like 3rd, 4th option on the team, and 9 touchdowns, almost 600 yards is pretty solid. And he was on a nice path. And then the Bills draft Dalton Kincaid, and the receiving role goes down. But Knox is still an important part of the structure of the offense, not only running the ball like I talked about, but for Dalton Kincaid to be the type of player that the Bills want him to be, Knox has to do a lot of the inline stuff so that Dalton Kincaid can be the move piece tight end, right? There's a cause and effect there. And Knox frees up Dalton Kincaid to be used in his optimal way. Now, it's no longer a $14 million a year contract. He took a pay cut that has it down to $9.8 million a season, and it's been that way for a couple years, and it will be this year and next. And the structure of that deal changed quite a bit. Obviously, Knox took a pretty significant pay cut, but in return, it pretty much locked him into the team because the contract no longer became attractive for the Bills to get out of it. So he took a pay cut, but he also preserved his longevity on the team. And, you look at certain deals, and at a certain point of the deal, there's usually a point in time where it's the attractive opportunity for the Bills to get out of the deal. And because of the pay cut, that really disappeared for the Bills and Dawson Knox. So he's at $9.8 million a season, which is still a lot of money for a number 2 tight end that mostly blocks and catches like 20 passes a year. I get that. I think it's becoming more digestible as you've seen some other tight ends start to get some money. Number 2 tight ends like Josh Oliver with the Vikings, $7.7 million a season. Of course, TJ Hawkinson's the guy there. He's the number 2 guy that does a lot of the same stuff I'm talking about. John Bates with Washington, $7 million a season, specializes in blocking, almost no receiving production, but they like what they get from Zach Ertz in that flex role, and John Bates helps accomplish that. Colby Parkinson with the Rams, $7.5 million a season. How about this one? Look what the Bears just did. They gave Cole Kmet a contract extension that pays him $12.5 million a year, and then they turn around and draft Colston Loveland with the number 10 pick in the draft. It's going to be a Knox situation all over again. So it's not like the Bills are alone in this world of, hey, you have a really expensive number 2 tight end and the dynamic shift, and you're not necessarily getting the receiving production that you want out of him. So no, he's not living up to 14 or even 9.8 million a season, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't fill a valuable role for the team. And I think with Dawson Knox, there's also the leadership component that you have to get into. I've had a few personal run-ins with Dawson Knox. Strikes me as an absolute A-plus dude. And I love listening to him talk about the team, and especially the way that he defended Dalton Kincaid coming out last season, where, let's be honest, a lot of the fan base is down on Dalton Kincaid and has been pretty loud about their dissatisfaction. And what Dawson Knox came out and said during locker room cleanouts was incredible. He's exactly the type of teammate you'd love to have. And, he's a guy that I think the Bills are going to stay committed to for the long haul. I've said before, I think he's a Bill for life. And next year in 2026, he's scheduled for a $17 million cap hit. Now, I don't think the Bills will live with that, and I'm expecting the Bills to actually deal with that by extending him and then taking advantage of an opportunity to spread that cap hit out over an extension to reduce his 2026 cap hit, but then kind of lock in a player that I think is important to the team. And I think also Dawson Knox embodies everything that I believe Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane want in a player. And players like this are important. You need players that set the tone, players that take ownership in the overall operation. Good football teams are not coach-driven. They're player-driven. And I think Knox is the type of player that provides that for the Buffalo Bills, and a guy that I think deserves some more love. All right, I got a whole lot more to get to. 4 more players, and on the other side of it, a defensive starter and one of the most important role players on the team. We're breaking that down next. Folks, be sure to stick with me. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day, and you suddenly realize that you want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Gametime comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last-minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you could splurge on food, drinks, merch, or even invite a bigger group to come with you. Gametime makes it all possible. And Gametime makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to the start of the game or the event, and they've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. I love those seat views right in the app before you buy, so you know exactly what the view will be when you get to the venue. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, folks, we talked a lot about Dawson Knox. We're going to move on now and get into the next underappreciated member of the Buffalo Bills, and I want to discuss Taylor Rapp. Taylor Rapp came to this team and was in a tough spot. You're part of the succession plan for legendary players like Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer. It's always going to be tough to be the next player when you're succeeding those types of guys. And no, he's not Poyer or Hyde. And he's certainly been involved in some friendly fire that has led to some injuries for the Bills. And I think those dynamics have soured the perception of what Taylor Rapp provides this team. I love physical, aggressive, violent football players. I don't love the result that you can injure your own teammate, but football is a fast, physical, and violent game. That's what it is. And you don't want to have to tell your players to ramp it up and be physical. Taylor Rapp is a tone setter for the physicality of the Buffalo Bills defense. And he is one of the very best tackling safeties in the NFL. And I think he's one of the best tackling players on this Bills defense. It's probably Christian Benford number 1 and Taylor Rapp number 2 in terms of best tacklers on this defense. And you watched the Bills last year, you know how many times he saved the Bills bacon. Last line of defense makes a key tackle in space. The next thing you know, they don't score a touchdown because Taylor Rapp makes a big tackle and they have to execute further and they settle for a field goal or the Bills take away the football. You know this has happened multiple times. His missed tackle rate is exceptional. Last year, 3.6%. In 2023, 4.7%. I think under 10 is awesome. Under 5% is elite. He is an outstanding tackler for a defense that is not typically that good at tackling. Oh, by the way, are we going to overlook all the timely takeaways that he's had over the last 2 seasons? How about that interception against Baltimore? That was important in the playoff win. Fourth quarter against Indianapolis this past season, a regular season win. Indy's driving, Taylor Rapp with the pick. How about the opening drive pick against Kansas City and the regular season win? Did you enjoy the 2023 interception in Week 18 against Miami to seal the game and win the AFC East? This guy's made some huge plays. Now, unfortunately, he got injured on that particular interception that took him out of the postseason. He got injured against Baltimore, kept them out of the AFC Championship game. But the point being is this defense is obviously at its best when Taylor Rapp is on the field. Let's give him some more love. He's a good player. And here's another layer of the Taylor Rapp conversation. Yeah, he tackles. Yeah, he's come away with some big takeaways and big moments. He's a very economic option. He's entering year 2 of a 3-year, $10.6 million deal. He's the 43rd highest paid safety in the NFL. 43rd. Get a lot of value out of this player. Give him some more love. Taylor Rapp. How about this guy? Said I had a key role player for you. How about Ty Johnson? Bills running back, an outstanding signing in late August in 2023. Not typically the type of player that should be available. And I remember that reactionary podcast when the Bills signed Ty Johnson. And I said, look, this is not a nothing signing. This is a rosterable NFL back. And he's become a very important role player for the Bills. I think in so many ways, if you're being realistic, about as ideal of a RB3 as you can get. Now, of course, you'd love for your running back room to be Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, and Jahmyr Gibbs, right? That's your dream running back room. But in a real world, this type of player as your RB3 is outstanding. He can fill so many different roles. 5'10", 210 pounds, so good size. He ran a 4.40 in the 40-yard dash. He's a really big-time explosive athlete. And that size, speed, dynamic makes him an effective inside and outside runner. He gives you an explosive element with the ball in his hands, but also physicality. He runs hard and can get yards after contact. He's got an outstanding receiving profile. We've seen that for sure. He's taken away receiving opportunities from James Cook, who is here to be a receiving back initially. He's the Bills' best pass protecting back, can help as a kick returner, has played snaps covering kicks and punts. I mean, the dude does a lot, and his contract is an insane value. 2 years, $5 million. That's what the Bills were able to get him back on this offseason. I am just floored by that. I thought he would get a lot more money. And he's back with the Bills, 2 years at $2.5 million a season. Obviously, a lot of value there. Josh Allen has called him the best third down back in the NFL. And this guy plays high leverage snaps for the Bills offense. He's on the field in 2-minute, right? End of half sequences because of how effective he is on passing downs and the multifaceted skill set that he brings. And when you're talking 2-minute, you're talking hurry up, throwing the football, and not only the trust and feel that Josh Allen has with him to go out and run routes and be a receiving threat, but hey, if he's sensing pressures coming and he wants to keep in a back or a player to block, there's belief that Ty Johnson can handle that. That trust and feel is a big time in these high leverage snaps that he's on the field for. Not a player I think anyone should be taking for granted. You know, the Bills have had a lot of third running backs that are absolute nothing burgers. Think about like TJ Yeldon. I think the Bills have mostly throughout the McDermott era not really done well to get more than one back going. You know, you kind of have like an okay number 2, but never a number 3. And this role that Ty Johnson has carved out is awfully impressive to me. And don't underestimate or underappreciate what Ty Johnson does for this team, especially for such a modest contract. All right, coming up next, a rising star and a deep sleeper that we'll break down here. Folks, be sure to stick with me. All right, welcome back. The next player, a guy that I think is young and ascending, and his name is Greg Rousseau. I think people forget how young he is. After playing just 478 snaps in college at a new position, he was a high school wide receiver and safety. He goes to Miami and converts to the defensive line, plays just 478 snaps for his college career. He just turned 25 in April. And he's coming off of a 2024 season where he matched a career high with 8 sacks and set new career highs in tackles, tackles for loss, quarterback pressures, quarterback hits, and forced fumbles. The guy was top 10 in total pressures among defensive ends in the NFL last year. And let me tell you something that might put your jaw on the floor. Let me give you a list of 5 players that Greg Rousseau had more pressures and less pass rush snaps than last year. More pressures, but less pass rush snaps. How about this list of names? Max Crosby, TJ Watt, Brian Burns, Trayvon Walker, George Karlaftis, to name a few. And I'll tell you this, if you look at that list of the top 10 players in terms of total pressures on the quarterback, I promise you Greg Rousseau is the best run defender on that list. I think Greg Rousseau is a top 5 run defending defensive end in the NFL, which, as we talked about with Dawson Knox, if you're going to play the game a certain way, you got to have players that can do certain things to make that possible. And Greg Rousseau and his ability to play the run for a defense that presents the highest percentage of light boxes on rundowns to the opposition, he matters a ton. And he's a very economic contract. He's only the 14th highest paid defensive end in the league. Yeah, it's an expensive deal, $20 million a season, but not that expensive relative to what the best defensive ends in the league are getting paid. And as I try to figure out, where some of the lack of love comes from, in the case of Greg Rousseau, I think you could certainly point to some of the postseason games and wish that he was more impactful, and when we're just looking for more defensive line impact in general, right? Don't be mad at Greg Rousseau because he isn't Myles Garrett or he isn't Nick Bosa or he isn't Micah Parsons. Don't be mad at him for that, right? Or that he's not Trey Hendrickson. He's not paid like he's those players. He's paid appropriately, and he's an ascending young player. I think he's the best defensive lineman this team has, and he's 25 years old. He's locked in, and there's a lot of reason to believe that he's still very much an ascending player. So open up your mind and love Greg Rousseau a little bit more than you do. The last player I want to get into is the deep sleeper. This guy might not even make the team, but I want to talk about him. Jalen Virgil, wide receiver. We look at this wide receiver core. I do, and I think there's a top 5 that I expect to make this team. Khalil Shakir, Keon Coleman, Josh Palmer, Elijah Moore, and Curtis Samuel. You've heard me talk all offseason long, or really since the Bills signed Elijah Moore, that the challenge with that group of 5 is that none of them help on special teams. And it matters a lot. Your 4th and or your 5th receiver are usually important players for your special teams units. And none of those guys really provide it. Now, the one thing that I've said is that my hope is Elijah Moore is the punt returner, because if Elijah Moore is the punt returner, that bumps Brandon Codrington off the roster, and then that opens up your opportunity to roster a Dane Jackson, or I think the Bills should definitely be rostering Jamarcus Ingram to help in the world of covering kicks and punts. If that doesn't happen, which there's absolutely no guarantee that it will, you're going to be looking for special teams impact out of your wide receiver room. Jalen Virgil is a guy that I believe can provide that. I think one of two things can happen. If the Bills keep 5 receivers and it's not the obvious mix, I think he's the guy that crashes the party. I think he's the one guy that makes it over one of those other players, because quite honestly, he has a chance of being more relevant to making an impact on the team. It's unlikely, we have to accept this, that the 5 receivers, Shakir, Coleman, Palmer, Moore, Samuel, while we're all hopeful and optimistic, there's a good chance that 1 or 2 of them are pretty much irrelevant this year for this team. It will be unlikely that 5 receivers plus Dalton Kincaid plus Cook are going to be, legitimate answers for this offense. And because of that, your depth needs to be able to help in other ways. Virgil can help on special teams. He has spent time on the Bills' 53-man roster. He was signed to the active roster at one point last year. The Bills maxed out his call-ups last year when he was on the practice squad. He came back, right? And when the Bills had him on the active roster, he got the gunner reps on the punt team opposite of Cam Lewis in the 5 games that he was in 5 different games last year. He was the primary gunner with Cam Lewis. And those are the most important players in your punt team. They're the outside players that, have to get down the field and make the tackle or leverage the ball or influence, the returner initially. That's a huge role. And he got those chances. Mac Hollins didn't always do that. Jamarcus Ingram did it a lot. It was always Cam Lewis and then either Jamarcus Ingram, Mac Hollins, or Jalen Virgil. That says a lot for a team where we're kind of wondering where the special teams contributions come from. Jalen Virgil, 6 foot, 210 pounds, ran 4.41 at his pro day, relative athletic score of a 9.16 out of 10. So he's got size and speed, has had opportunities to contribute on special teams in the NFL. And don't sleep on this. In college, he was a kick returner. He had 37 kick returns, averaged 31 yards per kick return, and had 3 kick return touchdowns. Don't sleep on him. Am I going to sit here and predict right now that Jalen Virgil makes this 53? No, I'm not ready to do it. But I'm not sleeping on the skill set. As I've seen some 53-man roster projections with Laviska Shenault on them, this is a guy to me that offers way more than Laviska Shenault. A lot of love for Tyrell Shavers? I don't know. Caden Prather, can he crack it as a 7th-round pick? I don't think so. I don't think KJ Hamler can do it. This is the one. This is that guy in the receiver conversation that I think has the best chance to crash the party. And don't be surprised if it happens. And hopefully, in listening to that conversation there, you can understand why it's a possibility that's worth discussing. So there you have it. 5 underappreciated members of the Buffalo Bills. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Hope that you come on back. Make sure that you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills. And I look forward to catching up with you again real soon.